Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to start a 4-week series with you entitled How to Be an Ally. We're very grateful to the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment for this opportunity. Recently they held a 3-day conference in Spokane in which guests were there from the 5 Northwest states, or actually delegates, and they brought in speakers and presenters from throughout the United States. In this 4-week series, we're going to break into 4 areas to talk about how to be an ally. The Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment deals with hate crimes in the Northwest and the problems of victimization. On program number 1, we're going to talk about the rise in hate crimes, not only here in the Northwest, but around the country. And 3 people who are participants at that conference are highly qualified to discuss this very, very critical issue for us at this time. I welcome to the program, first to my far right, is Mr. Marvin Stern, who is the Northwest Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and Mr. Stern is also a board member of the Northwest Coalition. Marvin, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
I'm also very pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Elsie Scott. She is the Executive Director of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. She is also participating in this conference, and we're very pleased to have you, Elsie, on our program.
Thank you.
And our third guest is Barry Kowalski, who is the Deputy Chief of the Criminal Section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department, and he is here, too, to talk about the role that we see for government in dealing with this serious problem. Barry, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
In pursuing this very, very serious topic, I would like to start by asking each of you, from your perspective, what your organizations, or in your case, the government, sees as the problem with hate crimes in America. And I think I'm going to start with Marvin this time, because I know that the ADL has got a lot of information they've put out on the problem. Would you share with our viewers to what extent is this a problem, and is it growing in the country?
Anti-Semitic incidents, which is the primary focus of ADL's gathering of information in the area of bigotry, has seen significant increases, particularly over the past 2 years. Last year we had a total increase of about 2%, which followed a previous increase of about 18.5%. The number of incidents totally are in excess of 1,400, which isn't a large number taken nationally in terms of a population of near 6 million Jews. Nevertheless, the trend that it indicates and the frequency with which these incidents occur suggests a parallel problem in other minority communities as well.
And so you're speaking of statistics that relate to one community, and there are a number of other communities that the statistics would have to be added to those.
We track incidents relating to vandalism against Jewish institutions, harassment threats, or other kinds of incidents involving Jews and the Jewish community.
Elsie, you come from the vantage point of being able to talk with people around the country, since you're a national organization, and particularly in the field of law enforcement. What is your organization and your people telling you about the problem?
Well, our organization is primarily made up of law enforcement executives throughout the country, and they are finding that they're getting more reports. We don't have any organized way of counting the data until we get the Hate Crime Statistics Act implemented, but from just informal reports, we are finding that more crimes are being reported to the police. And our organization, being a predominantly black organization, we are tracked into the black community, and we are finding that there are increased attacks against black people. I think most cities are showing that, except for places where blacks are in a very small minority, that blacks tend to have a very high rate of victimization in these types of cases.
And that victimization is taking place, is it generally spread across the country, or is the increase concentrated in certain regions of the country, or certain cities, for example, in the country?
Now, surprisingly enough, it's happening across the country. I think, when we look at historical hate violence, we think of the South, but that is no longer the case. And then the interesting thing that we are finding that college campuses, our members who are heads of security on colleges and universities, are finding that they are getting increasing reports, not of vicious attacks on the college campuses, but a lot of harassment of gay people, of black people, of Jewish people, Southeast Asians, and Hispanics.
Barry, you come to us from government, and you certainly have had a lot of experience in dealing with the issue of prosecution of hate crimes. We're going to get into some of that in more detail, but would you add to what our other two guests have said about statistically what is happening?
Well, we are primarily, in my position, a reactive force. We prosecute crimes that are a violation of specific federal laws, so we don't actually keep data ourselves. However, recently, as you know, there is the Hate Crime Statistic Act that has been passed, and the FBI is responsible for implementing it, and we hope by January of 1991 it will be implemented and data nationwide will be collected on this.
At this conference, another person who participated was from the federal government's Uniform Crime Reporting, and the new federal legislation that Dr. Scott indicated is in place. And do you think that we'll have much more accurate statistics? In other words, one has to understand the depth of the problem as one deals with how to combat it or what resources are needed. And do you think a year from now, if we were doing this program, that we'll have a much better handle on the whole issue of the problem?
Well, since it's something new that's being collected nationwide, it's hard to predict what it'll be like in a year, but certainly we'll have more information a year from now than we have right now.
I'd like to back up, and maybe I should have done this first, but I just wanted to get out before our viewers the seriousness of the problem, and those statistics that Marvin referred to are very, very serious and on the rise. But we probably should have also assisted our viewers by getting involved with some definitions. And Elsie, I'll start with you this time. When we talk about hate crimes, what is the definition of hate crimes in relation to or compared with other criminal actions that take place that we've had a longer history of defining what they are?
We've defined a hate crime as an act or a threatened act against a person or a person's property because of the person's perceived race, ethnicity, national origin, or sexual orientation. And we also look at hate activity and hate violence. So we also are looking at activities that may not be against the criminal law, but that we feel like law enforcement should be addressing, at least in terms of being responsive to victims. But when we talk about cases that are prosecutable, then there are a number of crimes such as assault. I think assault is one of the major areas, vandalism, arson, cross burnings. Those are some of the crimes that are generally found within the hate violence category.
Barry, would you add to that in talking about, oftentimes for we who are supportive of legislation dealing with what we call bias crime reporting, uniform crime reporting, and in relation to what else is saying, there are legislators who will say this is not needed, that already we have laws that cover criminal acts. And would you explain to our viewers why it's very important to both in criminal penalties and civil remedies that can come involved, and even statistical gathering of information, why that is justified with special category?
Yeah, well, the kinds of criminal acts that Elsie was just speaking of are all addressed in state and local law enforcement statutes under such things as assault or vandalism or malicious destruction of property. And frequently such crimes are prosecuted in that fashion. But on some occasions, there are incidents which occur which have a broader meaning, if you will, where there's more involved than just the crime against a specific person, but an effort to intimidate a large group of people as a whole. A cross-burning in front of one person's home doesn't just intimidate the family in that home, but it intimidates all the people of that race or ethnicity. So therefore, there is a need both at the state level and the federal level to treat these kinds of crimes a little more seriously.
I'm going to go to our other two guests to deal with exactly the same question. I think it's very fundamental important. Marvin, I will ask you to, from the perspective of ADL, explain why that is so important.
Well, I think the community aspect is so significant here. that, as Barry suggests, the message is not just to the individual or to that individual family, but to that person's entire community, whether that be religious or racial or what have you. And the need to address that the tension that potentially can be created by that kind of incident, as well as the isolation that the victim and his or her individual family and community will feel as a result of being victimized, is very crucial and deserving of additional attention by law enforcement and the prosecution process.
Elsie, I know you hear this same argument too, and again, I've read some of your literature. Your organization does an absolutely outstanding job of both defining the hate crimes and also explaining the reason for that kind of legislation. Would you also share from your perspective in Noble what that would be?
Okay, first let me just backtrack. In our definition, we also include religious crimes motivated because of religion, and that was one I forgot to mention. But we do get criticism all the time whenever, I think Marvin and I did a radio show in Seattle, and one of the callers wanted to know whether a murder of his wife was his mother would be taken more lightly than a murder of my mother because my mother was black and his mother was white. And I told him, no, it's not the murder per se, that every murder is considered a crime against society, but what we're saying is that when a person is murdered or assaulted purely because of some factor this person had no control over, then we said that adds extra trauma to the victimization. It's traumatic to be a victim in and of itself, but when a person is singled out because of his religion or national origin or what have you, then often that's a greater stress. And then, as it already has been mentioned, that often it impacts the whole community. And we look at history, and we look at some of the major atrocities of history, is that a lot of the crimes have been motivated around race or religion, the Holocaust, slavery, the race riots we've had in this country. So we feel like there is a need for society to specifically address these types of crimes because often they have a greater impact on society as society on a whole.
And I think that that's the intended message, and often at times that is beyond the individual targeted for the crime. It's the message to the community that the perpetrator is trying to send.
And the use of the word community, some people might think we're talking about the community in which it happens, but we're talking about that larger community of all individuals who are a member of that community throughout the United States or maybe even
throughout
the world.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if we can just pursue this a little bit further, if you do not get involved with proper legislation and also the proper implementation and enforcement, in the long run, what can that do to a society? Or people who are on the sidelines who are watching and are really questioning, where they are going to be in relation to that issue. Could you elaborate upon that? Elsie, would you like to start?
Yes. Well, we feel that by ignoring the problem, often it causes it to escalate. We also look at what are the consequences of an inadequate response. Inadequate responses often lead to retaliation by the victims. So if the victim feel like the police are not going to respond properly, prosecutors are not going to respond properly, then they're going to take the law into their own hand. That we may see an escalation of this type of activity because the perpetrators will say that the government doesn't care about these victims and therefore we can go and intimidate other persons. That it makes for, when we train law enforcement personnel, it makes for poor police-community relations on the part of that whole class of people when we don't give the proper response. When Noble first became involved with this whole issue of hate violence, a lot of law enforcement officials did not want to get involved because it had not become a problem in their community. And they thought that if we didn't talk about it, the problem would go away. But from my studying of hate violence throughout history, there are, we like to say at Noble that it's like a volcano, that you never know when it's going to erupt again.
Barry, let's talk a little bit about the prosecution, because you've been involved in prosecution of hate crimes. And I believe that I am correct that one of your better known cases was in Dallas, that you were involved with the prosecution of what we described as racist skinheads in the past.
That's correct.
Would you give us a little background in presenting a prosecution that involves hate crimes? I know that preparation is the same in the sense that you have to have evidence and so forth, but what makes that different in any way than from other kinds of prosecution that you've been involved in?
Well, specifically with the federal prosecution, we have to establish federal jurisdiction. Crime in this country is primarily enforced by states and localities, and the federal criminal code is fairly narrowly drawn because our Constitution leaves that job for the states rather than the federal government primarily. So as a result, we have to look for evidence that the perpetrators were trying to interfere with some person's federally protected rights. As an example, in our case in Dallas, we prosecuted a number of individuals from a group called the Confederate Hammerskins, some young people between the ages of 16 and about 22. This group of racist skinheads were going to a park called Robert E. Lee Park in Dallas and chasing blacks and Hispanics from the park. They also, on several occasions, vandalized Jewish synagogues and a community center in the city of Dallas. The crime was a federal crime because they intended to interfere with, in one case, the group's use of a public accommodation, the park, and in the other case, the group's use of an enjoyment of property. We all have a right to enjoy property and public accommodations in this country without being violated because of our race or religion. So sometimes it gets a little tricky to be able to establish that a hate crime is also a federal law violation.
I have a little follow-up question there. I know in the 1960s when it was so difficult to get a conviction for murder in the South if the victim was of color. And that is my understanding why that there was the implementation, or actually initiation of legislation that wound up that federal prosecutions could take place because the person's civil rights had been denied them if they were murdered. In other words, a lot of juries in the South were not returning a guilty verdict. So you have an arena that you can operate in that at one time you could not, and that would involve civil rights, and hate crimes would be coming under that.
Well, there were statutes actually that have been in existence since post-Civil War days that reached a lot of this criminal activity, but in 1968, you're correct, the statutes were improved and expanded, and we do have ability to prosecute many crimes, but not all crimes. And I should add that in most cases, these kinds of crimes are prosecuted with state and local statutes, and we don't become involved in the vast majority of them.
In dealing with, back to the issue of reporting hate crimes, I want to ask Elsie and Marvin both again. Now that we have the new federal legislation in place for vice crime reporting, and we have in some states, and you probably have statistics, comes to mind like half the states, maybe I'm wrong, that have what we call state vice crime, uniform crime reporting. Some states are now contending, well, it's not needed because we now have the federal legislation. Would you both share with us why you think that it's also necessary to follow it up at the state level?
Just the opposite. I think that the federal statistics will only be as meaningful as the local statistics that are plugged into the system. So it's very crucial that the state implement the gathering of those statistics in order that the national statistics be meaningful.
I agree with Marvin. I really don't have much to offer there, except to say also that there are some problems now in the implementation of the National Hate Crime Statistics Act because we're having budget problems at the federal level, and there is now some talk about moving the Uniform Crime Report out of the FBI to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And if that does occur, then you may have less reporting on the part of the states unless they have mandated reporting, because at this point, you know, you have most larger law enforcement jurisdictions are reporting into the Uniform Crime Report. But I think part of it is because of the credibility of the FBI. And if it's moved into a research agency, then it may not have that same credibility. But only about 12 states now that have reporting requirements.
And if those states don't have it, and if we don't get proper funding federally, then this has all just been symbolic.
I wouldn't say it's all been symbolic. I think that those 12 states perhaps may enhance their reporting, and we could get some good reports out of that. But I think it's just a time now for people to continue to be diligent in their state with their state legislature.
I guess what I'm trying to pursue here is the need for both proper funding, and that brings me to another question I want to deal with you else on this. If we don't have proper funding, or even if we do have proper funding, this is a new area that we're getting into, and if there's not proper training of all law enforcement personnel, isn't that a problem? I'd like for you to address the issue of training individuals for that.
Yeah, there is a need for good training, and I'm glad to say that ADL has just produced a training film for law enforcement personnel, and they have been very active in trying to promote better training of law enforcement personnel. Noble has been very much involved with trying to improve training, and we're in the process of developing a training manual and a training film for command level officials. But we found in our surveys and our research that most police departments don't really devote that much training to hate violence. They may have a human relations course that the recruits get, but nothing for in-service persons. And then if they don't require reporting, then there's no need to train your personnel on how to report. But in the states where they do have reporting, we have seen an improvement in the training.
Marvin, would you, as ADL, since they are working very much in this area, would you like to address that same question?
Well, we know that in many municipalities around the country, law enforcement officials through city councils and the mayor's offices have elected to keep these statistics on a voluntary basis. And so training on a local level, meaning very local as opposed to state, we think will make a significant impact, particularly because of the kinds of communities that are choosing to go in that direction. And hopefully, by building kind of a critical mass on the local scene, the statistics will be more meaningful, and then we'll be able to implement programs to deal with the crime generally.
Barry, as someone who comes from, again, a government agency, would you agree that it requires special kinds of training to know, as you're investigating a crime, how that you should report?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things to bear in mind is that every incident that occurs between people of different races or different religions isn't necessarily based and motivated by hate. It could simply be a dispute over a parking space, irrelevant to race at all. And that's very hard to discern, and really the only way to get meaningful assessments of those sorts of situations is for law enforcement officers on the front line to be attuned and to ask the kinds of questions and do the kind of investigation immediately to discover and distinguish between these different types of crime.
And in doing that, we hear, as we relate to the rise in crime, that we are getting somewhat better at public relations of informing people that they can report and what that avenue is. Is that part of the increase? Or on the other side of that coin are there a lot of cases going unreported? Let's see.
We don't know. We think that there are a lot of cases going unreported, especially in some of the new immigrant communities. We recently did a conference in Portland, Oregon on the new immigrants, and we're finding that many of them don't trust the police because of their background of coming from countries where the police really were oppressive and they came from a police state. So now we have a new job of trying to encourage them to report, get beyond the language barriers, and getting blacks to trust the police enough so that they will report.
Marvin?
I think initially a lot of the growth or fluctuation will be based on fine-tuning the system. I think perhaps more significant than the raw numbers are the trends, the increases or the declines in those numbers over a period of a year or several years, because I think that's more indicative of the nature of the problem than the absolute numbers.
Yes. When you deal with those numbers, we look at categories, as you've been talking about those. In order of numbers of victims, are some groups being harassed and violence directed at them in increasing in larger numbers than other communities that we get statistics on? Marvin, would you like to do that?
We estimate, that is not just ADL, but organizations that keep these kinds of statistics, that 50% or more of the victims of these crimes are members of the gay community. And that's why in many states the effort is being made to include sexual orientation in malicious harassment legislation, because not as a civil rights issue, but as a criminal justice matter. If 50% or more of the victims of these crimes are gay, to keep those statistics out of the information being gathered kind of leaves the final data somewhat meaningless.
Also in relation to that, Barry, would you find that from a look at those that some groups or communities are more likely to report when they've been victims than others, such as the gay community? Or would a person who becomes a victim be less likely to report that than, say, somebody because of religion?
I really can't answer that. I certainly keep in contact with people like Marvin and respect his judgment on it, and I suspect what he'd have to say about that I'd agree with, but I don't have any data that we keep ourselves on that.
Elsie, would you?
Well, our experience has been that Jewish people do report because ADL has established a reporting system that's outside of the police department, something that's internal to their community they can trust. We haven't been able to put that together in the black community, so we are concerned that our data are not accurate for the black community. I think with the rise in gay groups, you'll find more reporting to the gay groups, but maybe not necessarily to the police.
With that, I'm going to bring our program to a conclusion. I wish we had more time. You all three are so articulate, and you've helped our viewers see the seriousness of what we're dealing with. Thank you for being here, and we also thank you for attending the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been discussing, as you know, a very, very serious topic. It is the first in a 4-week series. I hope you'll join us again next week when we'll continue this. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.